So what I'm saying to you is that I need you to tell me why you're not LARPing. I mean, I'm just trying to be totally blunt and honest with you.
Yeah. What do you like? What do you mean LARPing?
My position is that there is no such thing as gender, that it's a mindless social construction that is utilized to try to explain a category error. This category error that exists is that I believe and can 100% back up that most people use gender and sex interchangeably. They don't understand that there's a distinction between the two. And so when people say, I'm going to change my gender, they actually mean sex, vice versa. This is how people conceptualize these, at least average people or people who are non-transgender. Because it's a category error, I default to the thing that is not a category error, which is sex. Sex is a biological constant that exists in objective reality, regardless of belief. So if you're born a baby, you have no beliefs, for instance. However, your ability to have the means to produce certain gametes are not going to be in question, nor the biological plumbing that would normally lead to that. So sex is the default, and the construction is gender, and gender simply does not exist. It is, it doesn't exist. And my evidence for this, in order to provide it for you, is that I don't believe that you or anybody else can give me an example of gender that isn't actually fashion. And that any of the traits that you would consider to be non-interchangeable traits, meaning this one is for men and this one is for women, actually belong to the men or women, regardless of what the category may be. So you may say something like a deep voice, but I know women who have deep voices. You might say long hair, but I know men who have long hair. All right. All of these things, which would exist in the paradigm of what you might consider gender, are actually just fashion statements. And outside of that, anything that you would consider interchangeable, meaning this is a woman's role or a man's role, is going to be arbitrary. So it's subjectively made up, and it has no existence in biological reality. So my end result position on this is that transgenders are LARPing. They're just LARPing. That the things that they actually claim to be don't exist.
That's so interesting. I did not expect you to make this argument. So my conception or view of gender is that gender is essentially like a cultural story that we tell each other about the expectations for men and women. So when we talk about like male or masculinity as a gender, I think that the cultural stories we tell each other about what that entails involves a lot of things. For example, like chivalry or expectations about how men act with women, how they're able to provide for women. I think that those cultural expectations are what I would point to as gender. And I think that you're right that these are like social constructions. I would say that these are social constructions that are useful. So I think it's useful to have narratives that we impart to, future generations about how men and women are supposed to act. And I think that when a trans person says, I identify as a woman or I identify as a man, what they're really telling you is that they want to engage in those kind of social constructions. They want to take on the narrative that is told to them about the expectations of men or women. So I think that when a transgender man, that is someone who is born a woman, and decides that they want to take on the aspects of masculinity, what they're saying to you when they say they identify as a man is what they're communicating. They want to engage in that sort of cultural storytelling. They want to be, the provider for women. They want to be like a sort of protector.
You're saying a lot, but you're not saying anything, right? So you're saying, from my conceptualization, this is what I think this thing is. Again, it's an arbitrary categorization. So if I'm going to tell you what sex is, I don't need to be arbitrary about it.
Okay? What do you mean when you say arbitrary in this context?
It means arbitrary. I'll give you the exact definition if you want. Okay.
Yeah, or just like how you're using it.
If you want to use a paraphrase, like it's subjective essentially. Okay, it's all subjective. So you say, like, we culturally tell people what men and women should be, right? Well, no, we don't. What do you mean?
Don't think so.
How?
So, for example, like if you've ever watched a movie, like an old school romance, where the guy's taking the girl out on a date, and like he gives her his coat because she's cold, and people say, they point to that and they say, that's a man. That's the expectation for what a man does for a woman.
But it's arbitrary again. Like a woman could give a man her coat, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like whether or not a man or a woman does it is like, it's arbitrary in the sense that there are no physical laws that force it to be the other way around.
Right. It's a complete mental construction.
Yeah, and I would just say that mental construction has real world utility.
Well, okay, sure. You could say anything on planet Earth has real world utility that's a construction. I can say a picture of a leprechaun has real world utility in explaining the concept that of a fictitious leprechaun. But that wouldn't change the fact that my argument is that leprechauns don't exist, that they're make believe, that the entire thing is fabricated, and that just because something can be conceptualized as being something, and it might even have utility relaying it that way, doesn't mean that it exists in reality. And so if somebody dresses like a leprechaun, right, they're not really a leprechaun, right?
Yeah, I mean, my mind is just being blown that you're making this argument to me. I mean, I think like an analogy would be that like my conceptualization as God, as like someone who's non-Christian, is as this kind of ideal of the highest good, right? And I would say that like highest good, that person, that being that is like ultimately good in all ways, I can't point to that person in real life. I see them as like a conceptualization, something that exists in the abstract, but is still enormously influential and worth, aspiring to. And I think that the way I see genders, for example, male and female, is as templates to aspire to. So like a man or a woman, these are ideas, ways of being that I think people ought to aspire to for all their goodness. And so that would be my conception of gender as something that is meaningful and worth, keeping in society. I think that you're right in that, like, I can't point to something and be like, this is like objectively a man in the same way that, this is like a quark or a proton.
No. Well, I disagree. I think that there's several ways that you can objectively point to something and say this is a man.
Okay,
And
but you mean like in a sex way? The words are confusing, but I mean like in a gender way, right?
So just to define definition, I define woman as adult human female, and I define man as adult human male. These are the ways that I. Now, by the way, almost every dictionary definition that you dive into will affirm that that's how most people define it. And I think if you ask most people on the street, you probably wouldn't disagree with me that that's probably how they conceptually think of it.
I would say so, yeah.
Yeah, you would say so. So what I'm saying to you is that I need you to tell me why you're not LARPing. I mean, I'm just trying to be totally blunt and honest with you.
Yeah. What do you mean? LARPing?
So there's since there is no objective standard for any of these things, right? When it comes to gender, why are you not LARPing right now? How is this not a LARP to say I am this thing that I can't actually prove that I am, because it's just a construction that we just kind of arbitrarily made up out of whatever criteria I decide it needs to be.
But like, if you go to most American cities and talk to like young people, a lot of young people are enormously progressive and have a sense of like what is a man or woman that is disconnected from biology.
No, I don't think it is. See, I think that they're just lying, and that they do know.
I mean, I would say they define
they do know it's
LARPing,
but that for the purposes of wanting to join the woke in group and virtue signal, they pretend like they don't know what the difference is. But I think that they do. I don't think I really honestly 100% don't believe most people are confused by this at all.
I think this is, I don't know. I think you need to give them more credit. I think people genuinely believe that there's like a serious distinction between sex and gender. And I think if you talk to like any leftist or liberal on this platform who is like politically engaged, they're going to tell you they have this belief. And I don't think they're lying to you. I think they really believe that there is a distinction between sex and gender.
Okay,
And
I think you can point to a very few amount of Twitch leftist streamers who understand this conceptually. I'm talking about your average Joe on the street.
okay.
They don't. They do not. Right?
Yeah, and your average Joe is not like a 20-something-year-old progressive, which is like the people that I interact with most because of my age group.
They're not. It's true, right?
And I think that like
most people aren't even political. They just utilize these terms interchangeably. If you were to sit them down and tell them, here's what they mean by this, I think most of them would be absolutely fucking horrified, to be honest with you. They'd be like, what do you mean? Gender just means, like, I'll still hear right-wing political pundits say things like you can't change your gender, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that doesn't make any, it's an incoherent thing to say, right? That's actually incoherent. It's like you're saying you can't change the color of a leprechaun's hat. It doesn't mean anything, right? Of course you can change gender, you can change whatever you want in fictitious land because it doesn't exist. So, like, of course you can change it. But what they mean to say is you can't change your sex. That's what they're trying to say, right?
I think it's so interesting that you're making this argument, because usually the argument that I hear from like very right-wing people is that gender and sex are like innately tied, and gender is like a very real thing that is connected to sex. But it sounds like you're saying
that's a bad argument.
Interesting. Okay, tell me why you think that's a bad argument.
Because it's incoherent. They can't define gender any better than you can. So how is it innately tied to this thing that's biologically, objectively real? Well, but you can't tell me what it is. You know what I mean? It's fucking incoherent. It doesn't matter if the right wing's using it. It doesn't matter if the left wing is using it. It's incoherent.
And so earlier in this conversation,
I'll give you an example. Okay. Just give you an example, right? You can say race is real, right? Let's say race is real. But you can also, at the same time you say race is real, say the white race is not real. Right?
I believe you could say these things, but you're saying that these would be like, they don't make sense together?
I'm saying that the white race, a race of white people, is not real. It's a category error. There is no white race. Okay? So like Italians, for instance, these olive people or whatever, if they were socially categorized as white. This is a categorization that is literally an error. Now, but you can still agree that race is real. Okay? You're just disagreeing that this category of it is real. Okay? So this is where you guys mess this up with gender as well, right? Is you're saying this category for some type of societal normalcy is real. And you go, okay, how is it real? How? Well, I don't know. Well, it's the same thing you end up with when you're debating with white nationalists. They say this category is real. You say, how is it real? They don't fucking know either, because it's not real. It's just some social fucking construct that they made up in their brain in order to try to describe something that doesn't even really exist. And this is why we have a fucked up, messed up ass society that doesn't know its ass with its elbow.
Okay.
So this is what I'm saying.
I'm just writing this down. Earlier in this conversation, I gave the definition of gender. The gender is a set of cultural stories we tell ourselves about the expectations of certain people. And I think that those stories and those expectations have real world effects. So I think that when you tell people that like a man and a woman are supposed to interact with each other in this sort of way, and a man is supposed to provide for a woman financially and, with a home and whatnot, and a woman is supposed to provide a man with, a family with children and, to make sure that that man is able to provide for the family, that a man is supposed to act as like an emotional rock for a woman, and so on. When you tell people these sorts of like expectations, you influence the behavior of people in your society. And so I think the idea that like social constructs aren't real, I think is maybe like technically true, but it's not true that social constructs aren't influential. And so I think it's important that to the extent that we have social constructs, we manage them to make sure they are encouraging good behavior from people, behavior that we'd find desirable. And so he thinks, if you're telling people, especially right-wing people, that, it's arbitrary, that it like doesn't make any sense, I think people are going to feel frustrated because they see these social constructs as like distilled wisdom from generation to generation. And the idea that like you'd throw that out because there's a real thing that is sex and gametes and, genitalia and whatnot, I think is kind of, it's anathema to like the actual goal of distilling, curating, and
But wait, if we got rid
giving
of the
people generational wisdom.
wait,
Yeah, sorry.
Taftaj, it makes no sense.
Okay.
Because if you got rid of the category of gender as a social construct, wouldn't that affect people's lives also and guide the society as well?
I agree. Yeah.
Okay, so what we're arguing about really is that if we got rid of whatever your conception is of gender, right, that society would be guided down a road where people would look at sex as being the normative thing and not this bizarre arbitrary concept as being the normative thing, right?
I think what would happen is people would just like, they would just like attach those things more strongly to sex.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
So we would say this is typical female behavior, right? This is typical male behavior, right?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Right? This is the entirety of my argument, right? Is that all of these behaviors are linked to your biological sex and really don't have anything to do with social pressures from ridiculous constructs that people don't even fucking care about, right? Like most people don't sit at granddaddy's knee and listen to stories of days of yore in order to get their purview for how modern constructed society decides what gender role is for a woman. They don't operate that way. That's not how human beings operate in real time. They go, look, here's what men with, here's what men do. Here's what women do. Here's the thing women are interested in. Here's the things that men are interested in. And they associate it literally with their sex. They really don't associate it with some type of societal expectation at all. They tend to see it as they're just interested in these things because that sex is interested in those things. That's how I think people actually see these concepts, because that's probably how you and I see these concepts, to be honest with you. Like you don't see societal norms as a collection of stories that were told to you by other motherfuckers from days long past. You see women doing girl shit, and you ask them why they're doing it, and they're like, because I like fucking scrapbooking, I like coloring, I like doing this shit. So you associate that behavior with what? The sex. Like that's what you do.
Yeah. So would you say that if we didn't have cultural like stories, like the cultural stories don't influence people, or maybe they influence people only like 20%, but like 80% of why men go into engineering fields and women don't is, biological. That's what you would say.
Yeah.
And
like,
I think,
and it's provable, right? Like I don't even think that that's really disputed, right? I mean, dispute it if you don't think so, but I don't think that you can do it because clearly men, right, males and females have different interests in things, right? They just do. They have very different interests in different things,
Yeah. I mean, I think I agree. I agree that there are like
I don't think
biological
they like scrapbooking
reasons
because of stories, Like I you know what I mean? I don't think that they like to scrapbook and they like to fucking, do their little shit that they like to do because of a collection of cultural stories. I don't believe that. I think it's just nonsense.